Have you ever wondered why so many modern men seem lost, indecisive, and emotionally unstable? Why does an entire generation of men struggle to make firm decisions, avoid confrontation, and constantly seek external approval? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychologist, had a disturbing answer to this question. According to Jung, something fundamental has changed in the modern masculine psyche. This isn't just about sensitive men or new masculinity. It's much deeper and more alarming than that. Jung discovered that today's men have developed thought patterns that for millennia were predominantly feminine. But pay attention. We're talking about mental structures, decision-making processes, and ways of interpreting reality that Jung identified as specific psychic characteristics of each sex. What caused this radical transformation, and why did Jung consider this an alarm signal for our civilization? The answers will shock you and explain much about the masculine chaos we see today. 1. What Jung really meant by feminine thinking. When Carl Jung talked about feminine thinking, he wasn't making a judgment about women or suggesting that one way of thinking was better than another. He was describing something much more profound, two completely different ways the human mind processes reality, makes decisions, and approaches problems. Jung observed that the masculine mind traditionally operates through what he called directed thinking. This is linear, focused, and goal-oriented. It cuts through confusion like a sword, eliminates distractions, and moves straight towards solutions. The masculine mind asks what needs to be done, and then does it regardless of how others might feel about the process. The feminine mind, according to Jung, operates through what he termed undirected thinking. This is circular, intuitive, and relationship-focused. It considers multiple possibilities simultaneously, weighs emotional consequences, and seeks harmony above all else. The feminine mind asks, how will this affect everyone involved, before making any move? For thousands of years, these two thinking patterns worked together in a perfect balance. Men would make the hard decisions, take responsibility for outcomes, and push forward despite resistance. Women would provide emotional intelligence, consider the human cost of decisions, and maintain social cohesion. Neither was complete without the other. But something dramatic happened in the last century. Jung noticed that men were increasingly adopting feminine thinking patterns while abandoning their natural masculine ones. Instead of making direct decisions, men began overthinking every choice. Instead of taking responsibility, they started seeking consensus. Instead of leading with confidence, they began questioning their every instinct. This shift wasn't subtle. Jung watched as entire generations of men became paralyzed by the very thinking patterns that made women so effective in their roles. But here's the crucial point. When men adopt feminine thinking without balancing it with masculine decisiveness, they don't become better men. They become confused, anxious, and ineffective. The feminine mind in a woman's body serves a vital purpose. It connects, nurtures, and maintains relationships. But the feminine mind in a man's body, without the grounding of masculine directed thinking, creates chaos. It leads to endless second-guessing, chronic indecision, and a desperate need for external validation. Jung saw this transformation happening everywhere around him. Men who should have been making tough choices were instead forming committees. Men who should have been taking risks were instead playing it safe. Men who should have been leading were instead following, hoping someone else would make the difficult decisions. This wasn't evolution, it was confusion. The masculine mind wasn't designed to operate primarily through feminine thinking patterns, just as the feminine mind wasn't designed to operate primarily through masculine ones. Each serves its purpose, but when they're switched or imbalanced, both become dysfunctional. Modern society celebrates this shift, calling it emotional intelligence or sensitivity, but Jung understood the devastating psychological cost. When a man abandons his natural thinking patterns, he doesn't just lose his effectiveness. He loses his sense of self. He becomes a stranger to his own instincts, constantly second-guessing what should come naturally. The tragedy is that most men today don't even realize this has happened. They think their confusion, their indecision, and their constant need for approval are just part of being human. They don't understand that they've been trained out of their natural thinking patterns and into ones that, while valuable, were never meant to be their primary mode of operation. This is why Jung was so concerned. He wasn't advocating for a return to some primitive past, but for a recognition that different minds work differently. And when we force the masculine mind to operate against its nature, we don't create better men. We create lost ones. 2. The Great Reversal, how modern society confused the roles. Something unprecedented happened in the 20th century that Jung witnessed firsthand. Society began systematically rewarding feminine thinking patterns in men while punishing masculine ones. This wasn't an accident or a natural evolution. It was a complete reversal of thousands of years of human psychological development. For most of human history, survival depended on clear role divisions. Men needed to make quick, decisive choices under pressure. They needed to take risks, face danger, and make unpopular decisions when necessary. Their thinking had to be direct, focused, and action-oriented because hesitation often meant death for the entire tribe. Women needed different skills. They had to maintain complex social networks, read emotional cues, and keep peace within groups. Their thinking had to be nuanced, relationship-focused, and consensus-building because social harmony meant survival for children and families. But modern civilization changed everything. Physical strength became less important than emotional intelligence. Quick decisions became less valuable than careful consideration of everyone's feelings. Taking charge became less rewarded than building consensus. Schools began punishing boys for acting like boys. Sitting still became more important than taking action. Following instructions became more valuable than independent thinking. Boys who showed natural masculine traits, directness, competitiveness, risk-taking, were labeled as problems that needed to be fixed. The workplace followed the same pattern. Companies started valuing collaboration over leadership, consensus over decision-making, and emotional sensitivity over results. Men who displayed traditional masculine thinking, cutting through confusion to reach solutions, making unpopular but necessary decisions, taking responsibility for outcomes, were suddenly seen as toxic or outdated. Even relationships changed. Women began expecting men to think and communicate like women. Men were told that real strength came from expressing emotions, seeking validation, and avoiding conflict. The strong, silent type became the emotionally unavailable type. Decisive leadership became controlling behavior. Media and culture amplified this reversal. Movies and books began portraying masculine thinking as primitive and destructive. The hero's journey changed from a man conquering external challenges to a man conquering his own masculine nature. Success stories shifted from men who took bold action to men who learned to be more like women. Jung watched this transformation with growing alarm. He understood that society was essentially asking men to lobotomize half their brains. The directed, focused, action-oriented thinking that had built civilizations was being systematically trained out of boys and men. But here's what society missed. You can't simply replace masculine thinking with feminine thinking and expect the same results. When men tried to adopt feminine thinking patterns, they didn't become more effective. They became paralyzed by overthinking, crippled by the need for consensus, and exhausted by constantly managing everyone else's emotions. The reversal created a generation of men who were afraid to make decisions because they might upset someone. Men who avoided taking responsibility because they feared being blamed. Men who sought constant validation because they'd been taught that their natural instincts were wrong. Meanwhile, Women found themselves in relationships with men who couldn't lead, couldn't decide, and couldn't take charge when necessary. They got exactly what they thought they wanted, men who thought like women, and discovered it wasn't satisfying at all. This great reversal didn't create better men or better relationships. It created confusion, frustration, and a deep sense of loss on both sides. Men lost touch with their natural strengths, and women lost the masculine energy they actually needed and desired in their partners. Jung understood that this wasn't progress. It was psychological chaos. Society had convinced itself that eliminating masculine thinking would create a better world, but instead, it created a world where nobody could think clearly anymore. The reversal continues today, becoming more extreme with each generation. Boys are raised to suppress their natural instincts, while girls are encouraged to embrace theirs. The result is exactly what Jung predicted: a society full of confused, ineffective men and frustrated, unfulfilled women. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. 3. The man who lost his inner compass. Every man used to carry something inside him that modern men have completely lost. An inner compass that pointed toward truth, purpose, and right action. Jung called this the masculine instinct, and he watched in horror as entire generations of men began ignoring its guidance, choosing instead to navigate life through external opinions and social approval. This inner compass wasn't mystical or complicated. It was the voice inside a man that knew when something was right or wrong, regardless of what others thought. It was the instinct that pushed him toward challenges instead of comfort, toward responsibility instead of ease, toward truth instead of popularity. It operated below conscious thought, guiding decisions with a certainty that didn't need explanation or justification. Jung observed that healthy men throughout history relied on this internal guidance system. They didn't need to ask permission to act, seek consensus before making decisions, or validate their choices through other people's reactions. They felt something was right, and they did it. They sensed something was wrong, and they opposed it. Their compass pointed true north, and they followed it. But modern society systematically destroyed this inner navigation system. From childhood, boys learn to ignore their instincts and listen to external authorities instead. Teachers, parents, counselors, and friends became more important than their own internal sense of direction. The compass began spinning wildly, unable to find true north. The destruction happened gradually. First, boys learned that their natural impulses were suspect. When they wanted to compete, they were told to cooperate. When they wanted to take risks, they were told to be safe. When they wanted to lead, they were told to follow. Slowly, they stopped trusting their own instincts and started looking outside themselves for direction. Schools accelerated this process by teaching boys that all answers come from external sources. Success meant following instructions, not trusting intuition. Good behavior meant conforming to expectations, not acting on inner conviction. Intelligence meant memorizing what others had discovered, not exploring their own insights. By adulthood, most men had completely lost touch with their inner compass. They couldn't make simple decisions without consulting friends, researching online, or seeking professional advice. They couldn't trust their own judgment about relationships, careers, or life choices. They had become completely dependent on external validation for every important decision. This loss created a specific type of anxiety that Jung recognized immediately. The anxiety of a man who doesn't know what he wants or where he's going. Without an inner compass, every choice became a crisis. Should he take this job or that one? Should he stay in this relationship or leave? Should he speak up or stay quiet? Without internal guidance, these questions became paralyzing. The compass loss also created what Jung called the approval addiction. When men can't rely on their own instincts, they become desperate for others to tell them they're making the right choices. They need constant reassurance, constant validation, constant confirmation that they're on the right path. But external approval is never enough because it doesn't address the fundamental problem, the missing internal guidance system. Women particularly suffer from this loss in men. They find themselves in relationships with men who can't make decisions, can't provide direction, and can't take charge when needed. These men constantly ask their partners what they should do, how they should feel, and where they should go. The feminine energy ends up carrying the masculine load because the masculine energy has no internal compass to follow. Even worse, men without inner compasses become extremely susceptible to manipulation. They follow whoever speaks with confidence, adopt whatever ideology sounds convincing, and change directions whenever social pressure increases. They become followers by default because they have no internal system for determining their own path. Jung understood that this wasn't just a personal problem, it was a civilizational crisis. Societies need men who can navigate by internal principles, not external pressures. They need men who can make unpopular decisions when necessary, stand against crowds when required, and chart new courses when existing paths lead nowhere. The tragedy is that the compass is still there inside every man. It hasn't been destroyed, just ignored and buried under layers of external programming. Most men can still feel it sometimes, moments when they know exactly what they should do, regardless of what others might think. But they've been trained to dismiss these moments as selfish, primitive, or dangerous. Recovery requires a man to start trusting his instincts again, even when they conflict with social expectations. It means making decisions based on internal conviction rather than external approval. It means following the compass even when it points toward difficulty, challenge, or unpopularity. Jung believed that men who reconnected with their inner compass didn't just improve their own lives. They became forces for positive change in the world. They stopped being blown around by every social wind and became solid points of reference for others. They stopped following and started leading, not because they wanted power, but because they knew where they were going. 4. Why modern men run from responsibility. There's something deeply disturbing happening in modern society that Jung predicted decades ago. Men are systematically avoiding responsibility at every level, from personal relationships to professional obligations to social duties. This isn't laziness or selfishness, it's a psychological defense mechanism that develops when masculine thinking gets replaced by feminine processing patterns. Responsibility used to be the cornerstone of masculine identity. A man's worth was measured by how much responsibility he could carry, how many people depended on him, and how well he managed the weight of important decisions. Taking on responsibility wasn't just what men did, it was who they were. But somewhere along the way, responsibility became the enemy. Men began seeing it as a trap, a burden, or an unfair expectation. They started avoiding commitments, delaying major decisions, and finding creative ways to escape the weight of being accountable for outcomes. Jung understood why this happened. When a man tries to process responsibility through feminine thinking patterns, it becomes overwhelming. The feminine mind considers all possible consequences, worries about how everyone will be affected, and seeks to avoid any choice that might hurt someone. When applied to major responsibilities, this creates paralysis. The masculine mind handles responsibility differently. It accepts that difficult decisions will have negative consequences for some people, but makes them anyway because they're necessary. It takes ownership of outcomes without getting lost in endless analysis of what could go wrong. It carries weight without constantly questioning whether the burden is fair. Modern men lost this psychological framework. They were taught to think like women about responsibility, to consider everyone's feelings, to avoid decisions that might upset anyone, to seek consensus before acting. But responsibility doesn't work that way. It requires someone to make hard choices, accept difficult consequences, and keep moving forward despite criticism. The avoidance shows up everywhere. Men delay marriage because they fear the responsibility of being husbands. They avoid having children because they fear the responsibility of being fathers. They stay in jobs they hate because they fear the responsibility of finding something better. They live with their parents into their 30s because they fear the responsibility of independence. Even when men do accept responsibility, they often do it with resentment and anxiety. They constantly question their decisions, seek validation from others, and blame external circumstances when things go wrong. They carry responsibility like a heavy backpack instead of wearing it like armor. This creates a vicious cycle. The more men avoid responsibility, the more overwhelming it seems when they finally face it. The less practice they have making difficult decisions, the harder each decision becomes. The more they seek external validation, the less they trust their own judgment. Women notice this avoidance immediately. They find themselves in relationships with men who can't commit, won't make plans, and deflect difficult conversations. They end up carrying emotional and practical responsibilities that their partners should be handling. They become frustrated not just with the extra work, but with the lack of masculine energy in their relationships. Society enables this avoidance by creating endless escape routes. Men can delay major life decisions indefinitely while still appearing productive and engaged. They can avoid commitment while still enjoying the benefits of relationships. They can escape the weight of leadership while still receiving respect and status. But Jung knew that avoiding responsibility doesn't eliminate it. It just transfers it to someone else. When men refuse to make difficult decisions, women are forced to make them. When men avoid taking charge, women have to step up. When men won't carry the weight, women end up carrying it for them. The psychological cost is enormous. Men who avoid responsibility never develop the confidence that comes from successfully handling difficult challenges. They never experience the satisfaction of protecting and providing for others. They never build the internal strength that comes from facing fears and carrying weight. They also never earn genuine respect. People might be polite to men who avoid responsibility, but they don't look up to them. They don't turn to them in crisis situations. They don't see them as leaders or protectors or providers. They see them as overgrown boys who never learned to be men. Jung believed that men needed responsibility like plants need sunlight. Without it, they become weak, anxious, and purposeless. With it, they become strong, confident, and directed. Responsibility isn't a burden that society unfairly places on men. It's the mechanism through which men develop their psychological strength. The path back requires men to start accepting responsibility gradually, building their capacity like a muscle. Small commitments lead to larger ones. Simple decisions prepare for complex ones. Personal accountability develops into social leadership. But it all starts with a man deciding to stop running and start carrying his share of the weight. 5. The epidemic of masculine indecision. Never in human history have men been so paralyzed by simple choices. Jung witnessed the beginning of what has now become a full-blown epidemic. Men who cannot make decisions, even about basic aspects of their own lives. This isn't careful consideration or thoughtful planning. This is psychological paralysis that stems from abandoning masculine decision-making patterns. The masculine mind was designed to cut through complexity and reach conclusions quickly. It gathers essential information, weighs the most important factors, and chooses a direction. Once the decision is made, it commits fully and adjusts course if needed. This process allowed men to lead armies, build businesses, and navigate crises without getting lost in endless analysis. But modern men have adopted a decision-making process that creates confusion instead of clarity. They gather information obsessively but never feel like they have enough. They consider every possible outcome but can never account for all variables. They seek opinions from everyone but trust no one's judgment, including their own. This decision-making paralysis shows up in every area of life. Men spend months researching which car to buy, which job to take, or which apartment to rent. They create spreadsheets, read reviews, ask friends and consult experts, but still can't commit to a choice. They're looking for the perfect decision that doesn't exist instead of making a good decision and improving it over time. The paralysis becomes even worse with important life decisions. Men delay proposing to women they love because they can't be certain it's the right choice. They avoid starting businesses because they can't guarantee success. They refuse to have children because they can't predict all the challenges they'll face as fathers. Jung understood that this indecision comes from trying to use feminine decision-making patterns for masculine responsibilities. The feminine mind excels at considering relationships, emotions, and long-term consequences. But when men try to apply this approach to every decision, they become overwhelmed by complexity and paralyzed by possibilities. The problem gets worse because modern society offers infinite options for everything. Men don't just choose between a few career paths, they choose between hundreds. They don't just pick from local dating prospects, they scroll through thousands of profiles online. They don't just select from basic products, they compare countless variations with subtle differences. This abundance of choice combines with feminine thinking patterns to create decision fatigue before any choice is made. Men exhaust themselves researching options instead of choosing direction. They become experts on possibilities, but beginners at commitment. They know everything about their choices, but nothing about making them. The indecision creates a specific type of anxiety that Jung recognized as distinctly modern. It's not the anxiety of facing a dangerous situation or a difficult challenge. It's the anxiety of a mind that can't reach conclusions, can't commit to paths, and can't trust its own judgment. Women find this indecision particularly frustrating because it prevents relationships from moving forward. They meet men who can't decide if they want to be exclusive, can't choose when to move in together, and can't commit to future plans. These men aren't necessarily uncommitted to the relationship. They're uncommitted to making any definitive choices about anything. The indecision also prevents men from developing confidence in their judgment. Every time they avoid making a choice, they reinforce the belief that they can't trust themselves. Every time they seek external validation for decisions, they weaken their internal decision-making muscles. They become increasingly dependent on others to help them choose direction. Even worse, indecisive men often make decisions by default rather than by choice. They stay in situations not because they've chosen them, but because they haven't chosen to leave. They end up in careers, relationships, and living situations that happen to them rather than choices they actively made. Jung believed that decision-making was like any other skill. It improved with practice and deteriorated with neglect. Men who avoided making choices became worse at making them. Men who made decisions regularly, even imperfect ones, became more confident and effective over time. The solution isn't to make reckless choices or ignore important information. It's to return to masculine decision-making patterns that gather sufficient information, consider key factors, and commit to a direction. It means accepting that perfect decisions don't exist and that good decisions can be improved through action and adjustment. Recovery requires men to start making small decisions quickly and building up to larger ones. Choose restaurants without researching reviews. Pick clothes without comparing prices. Make weekend plans without polling friends. Build the decision-making muscle through daily exercise until it's strong enough to handle life's major choices. Men who learn to make decisions decisively don't just improve their own lives. They become attractive to others who are also tired of endless indecision. They become the people others turn to when choices need to be made, problems need to be solved, and direction needs to be established. 6. How the search for approval destroyed masculine authority. Something fundamental shifted in the masculine psyche when men began measuring their worth through other people's approval rather than their own achievements and principles. Jung observed this transformation with deep concern, recognizing it as the death of genuine masculine authority and the birth of a desperate, needy energy that repels rather than attracts respect. Authority used to come from within. A man earned respect by demonstrating competence, making difficult decisions, and standing by his principles even when they were unpopular. He didn't need others to validate his choices or confirm his worth. His authority came from his ability to handle responsibility, solve problems, and lead effectively when leadership was needed. But modern men learned to seek validation instead of developing competence. They became more concerned with being liked than being respected, more focused on avoiding criticism than achieving results. They started making choices based on what would generate approval rather than what would solve problems or create progress. This shift destroyed their natural authority because real authority can't be given by others. It has to be earned through action and demonstrated through results. When men started seeking approval, they gave away their power to anyone whose opinion they valued. They became dependent on external validation for their sense of self-worth and direction. The approval seeking shows up in countless ways. Men constantly explain and justify their decisions to anyone who questions them. They apologize for taking up space, expressing opinions, or making choices that might inconvenience others. They change their positions based on social feedback rather than standing firm on principles. In relationships, this creates a particularly destructive dynamic. Men seek constant reassurance from their partners that they're doing everything right, making good choices and being good partners. They become emotionally needy, requiring regular validation to feel secure in the relationship. Women initially might find this sensitivity appealing, but it quickly becomes exhausting. They find themselves in relationships with men who can't make decisions without approval, can't handle criticism without falling apart, and can't provide the steady, confident energy that masculine authority creates. The approval addiction also makes men extremely manipulable. They adopt whatever opinions get positive responses, support whatever causes generate social approval, and change their entire personalities to fit current social expectations. They become chameleons, shifting colors to match whatever environment they're in. Jung understood that this wasn't just a personal problem. It was destroying the foundation of social order. Societies need men who can make unpopular decisions when necessary, stand against crowd pressure when required, and maintain principles even when they generate criticism. Without this masculine authority, societies become unstable and directionless. The search for approval creates weak leaders who follow polls instead of principles, weak fathers who try to be friends with their children instead of guides, and weak partners who seek validation instead of providing strength. They become so focused on being liked that they forget how to be effective. Even in professional settings, approval-seeking men struggle to lead effectively. They make decisions based on what will be popular rather than what will work. They avoid giving difficult feedback because it might hurt feelings. They compromise their standards to maintain harmony, even when compromise makes problems worse. The tragedy is that the harder men chase approval, the less they receive genuine respect. People might be polite to approval-seeking men, but they don't look up to them. They don't trust them in crisis situations. They don't see them as authorities on anything important. Real masculine authority comes from competence demonstrated over time, principles maintained under pressure, and results achieved despite obstacles. It can't be faked, borrowed, or given by others. It has to be built through action and tested through challenge. Jung believed that men who developed genuine authority didn't need to seek approval because their worth was demonstrated through their effectiveness. They made decisions based on what was right rather than what was popular. They stood by their choices even when criticized. They earned respect through performance rather than seeking it through pleasing others. The path back to authentic masculine authority requires men to stop measuring themselves through other people's reactions and start measuring themselves through their own results. It means making decisions based on principles rather than popularity, standing by choices even when criticized, and building competence rather than seeking validation. Men who develop real authority don't just improve their own lives. They become stabilizing forces in their relationships, families, and communities. They provide the steady, confident energy that allows others to feel secure and supported. They become the men others naturally turn to when leadership is needed and decisions must be made. 7. The psychological price of abandoning masculine instinct. The cost of abandoning masculine thinking goes far deeper than poor decision-making or relationship problems. Jung discovered that men who disconnect from their natural psychological patterns pay a devastating price. They lose their fundamental sense of purpose, direction, and identity. They become strangers to themselves, living lives that feel hollow and meaningless despite external success. Masculine instinct isn't just about being tough or aggressive. It's about having an internal drive toward challenge, achievement, and protection. It's the voice inside a man that pushes him toward difficulty rather than comfort, toward responsibility rather than ease, toward building something lasting rather than just consuming what others have created. When men ignore this instinct, they don't just become less effective, they become psychologically sick. They develop what Jung called a specific type of depression that comes from living against one's nature. It's not sadness about external circumstances, but a deep emptiness that comes from betraying one's own psychological blueprint. This emptiness shows up as chronic dissatisfaction that no amount of external achievement can fix. Men climb career ladders but feel no satisfaction at reaching the top. They accumulate possessions but feel no joy in owning them. They check off life milestones but feel no sense of accomplishment or progress. The abandonment also creates what Jung identified as displaced masculine energy. The drive to compete, conquer, and create doesn't disappear when men suppress it. It gets redirected into unhealthy channels. Men become obsessed with video games, sports teams, or fantasy scenarios because these provide safe outlets for energies they're not allowed to express in real life. Even worse, suppressed masculine instinct often emerges in destructive ways. Men who can't channel their natural drives toward positive challenges sometimes explode in anger, engage in risky behaviors, or become addicted to substances that temporarily restore their sense of power and purpose. The psychological price extends to their relationships with other men. Men who abandon their masculine instinct lose the ability to form genuine friendships with other men. They become competitive in petty ways, jealous of masculine confidence in others, and unable to participate in the natural brotherhood that forms when men share common challenges and purposes. They also lose their connection to their fathers and male ancestors. Masculine instinct includes an understanding of one's place in the long line of men who faced similar challenges throughout history. Men who disconnect from this instinct feel cut off from this legacy, like they're floating without roots or context. The abandonment creates a specific type of anxiety that Jung recognized immediately. The anxiety of a man who doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing with his life. Without masculine instinct to guide them, men feel lost in their own existence, unable to distinguish between what they actually want and what they think they should want. This confusion extends to their sense of identity. Men who live against their masculine nature often feel like they're wearing a costume that doesn't fit. They present themselves to the world in ways that feel false and exhausting. They lose touch with their authentic selves and become whoever they think others want them to be. The price includes physical symptoms as well. Jung observed that men who suppress their masculine instinct often develop chronic fatigue, low motivation, and various stress-related health problems. Their bodies rebel against living in ways that contradict their psychological nature. Perhaps most tragically, men who abandon masculine instinct often pass this confusion to their sons. Boys learn from their fathers that masculine energy is dangerous, that masculine thinking is primitive, and that masculine instincts should be suppressed. The psychological damage gets transmitted from generation to generation. The recovery process isn't simple because it requires men to go against everything modern society has taught them. They have to learn to trust instincts they've been told are wrong, embrace energies they've been told are toxic, and pursue purposes they've been told are selfish. But Jung believed the alternative was much worse. Men who never reconnect with their masculine instinct live half-lives, never experiencing the deep satisfaction that comes from fully expressing their psychological nature. They become shadows of what they could have been, going through motions rather than living with purpose and passion. The psychological castration of modern men isn't an accident. It's the inevitable result of a society that decided masculine thinking was the enemy of progress. We've created a generation of men who think like women, seek approval like children, and avoid responsibility like cowards. Then wonder why our relationships are failing, our institutions are crumbling, and our young men are lost and purposeless. Jung's warning wasn't just about psychology, it was about survival. A civilization that systematically destroys the masculine mind while expecting masculine results is doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The tragedy isn't that men have lost their way, but that we've convinced ourselves this confusion is evolution, rather than recognizing it as the psychological suicide it truly is.